Senator Collins, I want to start with you today since you can only be with us for just a little while. You recently traveled to Cuba and wrote a special report about the trip. It seems like quite an experience. Did that trip change any of your views about the United States' relationship with Cuba?
It was a fascinating trip that gave me a much better understanding of the challenges and the changing relationship between the two countries. I left Cuba optimistic about the rebuilding of normal relationships between our two nations, but convinced that we need a step-by-step approach. So my views were changed in that I felt that the trip made me more educated about the challenges of reestablishing the relationship. I very much support lifting the travel ban so that Americans can travel freely to Cuba. I don't think that we should be restricting the basic American right to travel except to war zones or in other exceptional circumstances. And I think that that's a good beginning. I also supported the reopening of our embassy in Cuba, which has been closed since 1961, and the reopening of the Cuban embassy in Washington.
Senator Collins, the president can open an embassy and ease some travel restrictions, but economic sanctions are in the hands of Congress. Do you support lifting the economic sanctions against Cuba, and do you believe there are the votes in Congress to do so?
Well, there are people in Congress who are opposed to lifting even the travel restrictions. In fact, the House voted for an amendment to keep in place the current travel restrictions. I'm hopeful that in the Senate, where there's far more support for lifting the travel restrictions, that our position in favor of lifting those restrictions will prevail. On the embargo, I believe that we should start in a co-sponsored a bill to allow more trade between our two countries, but there are degrees. The one major question is whether Cuba should have access to the economic loans that we give frequently to foreign countries so that they can buy American products. And what I do want to make sure is that we do keep in mind that while we should move to a completely normal relationship, that we should not forget about Cuba's human rights violations and the fact that this still is a one-party state where Raul and Fidel Castro have already selected the individual to replace them in 2018, and where dissidents are still punished for taking on the regime. So I think we need to continue to stress human rights, and as we liberalize our relationship with Cuba, make some of that contingent on progress towards more freedom for the Cuban people.
Senator Collins, one of your colleagues, Senator and presidential candidate Marco Rubio, is calling on Secretary of State John Kerry to visit with Cuban dissidents on Friday. Do you agree with Senator Rubio?
I do believe that it would be good for Secretary Kerry not only to visit with the official Cuban government officials, but also with members of the dissident community. I met with a major dissident prior to going to Cuba, and he really opened my eyes to how desperately poor the Cuban people are. He encouraged me to bring all sorts of toiletries with me that I gave to the Catholic Church to distribute to the people there. And I not had that meeting, Given how controlled by the government much of our itinerary was, I think I would have not understood the need to go down the side streets away from the heart of Old Havana, which is very beautiful. And down those side streets, you see desperately poor people, crumbling buildings, and an infrastructure in need of repair. I think the best way to improve life for the Cuban people, however, is to have more trade between our two countries so that we can help the Cuban people who are desperately short of certain food products. They do not, for example, have a dairy industry. They're short of seed potatoes. I made a pitch for seed potatoes and blueberries while I was there, meeting with trade officials. So I do believe that a better relationship will improve the lives of the Cuban people, but we do have to keep in mind that dissidents are severely punished. I don't agree with Senator Rubio on the general approach to Cuba, where he has a very hardline approach and would not lift the travel restrictions.